Just setting up the live stream now.
Thanks, Mark. And we normally give it all kind of 30 seconds for everyone to dial in, connect to audio, etc., etc., etc. There's probably quite a few people watching this thinking, why is no one saying anything? The people who have dialed in so far. I promise we have more to say than this.
I'm just hoping my dog doesn't start barking. She might.
The trials and tribulations of attempting to do work and everything on Zoom calls and all the interruptions that you don't think about. I've seen some great stories of people not realizing they've not switched their webcams off.
The best one was in Wales, I think, isn't it? Doing a health committee meeting.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Numbers, there we go. Okay, so I think we'll kick off now. So hello and welcome to our event on the Beirut explosion. This is a joint event between the Fabian International Policy Group and the Young Fabians, which are branches of the overarching Fabian Society. We are a left-wing think tank and affiliate of the UK Labour Party. So tonight, myself and Alexander Hogg will be your co-hosts. Alex is a former Young Fabian Law Network chair, now between Lebanon and London himself, and I'm Cecilia, hosting in my capacity as being on a Young Fabian committee and the International Policy Group committee. So to contextualize this discussion a little bit for you, the Beirut blast was an explosion that quite literally shook the world. It was recorded as a seismic event of magnitude 3.3, felt in Turkey, Syria, and Israel, and is considered one of the most powerful non-nuclear explosions in history. The cause was the detonation of ammonium nitrate stores, which were stored at the port, and the effect was a supersonic blast wave, which ripped through the city, taking 220 lives, causing 7,000 injuries and destroying countless homes, rendering about 300,000 people homeless and counting. People in my own social circle sent through devastating photos of their own houses, shattered completely beyond recognition. And the question now turns to the aftermath. With the Lebanese government having resigned, yet protests still continuing, what happens now? President Aoun promised a transparent investigation, and yet this has not materialized. Documents circulated online appeared to show that customs officials sent letters to the judiciary seeking guidance at least 6 times from 2014 to 2017, but were ignored. The blast has inadvertently served to expose to the wider community a deep-seated level of corruption in governance that the Prime Minister has blamed. And a growing movement of protesters are calling for an international investigation into the incident. So tonight, we are really, really pleased to have joining us a spectrum of speakers. And first off, we've got Wayne David MP. He is the Shadow Minister for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs. Then we have Anna McMorrin MP, Shadow Minister for International Development. Aya Maizoub, North Africa and Middle East researcher for international NGO Human Rights Watch. George Ghali, Executive Director of ALEF, which is Act for Human Rights. And finally, last but not least, Nada Abdelsater-Abusamra, who is an international human rights lawyer. So my first question to you is, what are your initial thoughts on the potentiality of an international investigation and the ramifications of both sides of the coin for Lebanon's political stability? If one is carried out, for example, by a UN special rapporteur, what does that mean for Lebanon and long-term political stability? And if one is completely ruled out, what might that mean for the future? So we'll go to Nada first.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you, Cecilia, for the introduction. So I am an international lawyer, an international human rights lawyer, and within 48 hours after the blast, which is in our understanding a crime against humanity, in our view, it ticks all the criteria, the boxes of such a crime, and we can come to that later. Within 48 hours, I had several calls, tens of calls from friends and families, but mostly friends who were injured or suffered damages or had lost someone in this huge crime, calling me and asking, how can we do to have an international investigation? Because it was immediately clear that the direct cause of this bomb, or let me not say bomb, excuse me, of this explosion, was certainly the criminal negligence of the political of the Lebanese authorities, who were in charge of preserving the security of the Lebanese people. And the group was like something a little bit less than 100 victims. And my immediate reply was that the only way to have an international investigation is to ask the United Nations Security Council to make a decision to send a fact-finding mission, or it's like the rapporteur, but with a little bit more teeth, if you want, to send a fact-finding mission to Lebanon to investigate and to answer the queries, because the various versions started to fly. First of all, the Lebanese authorities tried to really send a stupid version over the media, saying that it was fireworks, a big storage of fireworks that took fire. And they soon thereafter changed that version because it was an absolutely ridiculous version. I mean, the magnitude is beyond what anyone can imagine. Then we heard versions about a bomb, a missile, having been shot, implicitly referring to an Israeli missile that would have shot this huge explosive bomb that was stored there. And then we had the versions of the nitrate ammonium, and how that nitrate ammonium had reached Beirut port. How come such a huge volume and mass of nitrate ammonium would be stored in that place, in one of the most populated areas of Lebanon? So we don't know what was there. Was it just nitrate ammonium? Soon, very, very quickly, experts told us that nitrate ammonium cannot explode on its own. So there must have been something that exploded this load of nitrate ammonium. Then we had different versions as to the volume. Was it 3,000 tons? Was it 300 tons? And then we started having the version that you've referred to, which is a ship having sailed, and in 2013, towards the end of 2013, the ship was so-called in danger. So there is a law firm that was requested to file a request to the judge of urgent matters in Beirut, asking for the ship to unload this very dangerous ammonium nitrate material, and within less than 48 hours from the explosion, the Lebanese politicians found it very handy and very convenient to start blaming that on the judiciary. So we had these letters that popped up to the surface of some the head of the customs in Lebanon, writing a letter to a judge, to a very junior judge, asking him to order that the ammonium nitrate be removed. This is absolutely absurd, because you don't write letters to judges. You know, you don't need to be a lawyer to know that you file a request, you file a complaint. And I mean, the proper way to activate a legal action is to go and file a lawsuit or a complaint. And by no measure whatsoever, by no criteria whatsoever, can a judge be liable for storage or unstorage of such material. And we had the Lebanese Judge Club, which is a very respectable, the only judge club in Lebanon. They issued a statement denouncing the interference of the politicians and the pressure that was being put on the judiciary, trying to blame this quasi-atomic bomb explosion on judges somehow. So it was immediately very, very clear that it's the Lebanese authorities' fault. Whether there was a missile or there was no missile, the storage of this huge bomb, it is a bomb, it exploded, whether it was by a missile or not. That's a different question, but there is a huge bomb that exploded that was onshore in Lebanon, in a very populated area. So and the Lebanese president, by the way, the Lebanese president and all the pyramid of the Lebanese authorities, it's passing by the prime minister, the various ministers, etc. Everyone confirmed that there was gross negligence that led to this explosion. So today we wonder what it was, how much it was, and what made it explode. Of course, we have, you've read and seen all the material on this ammonium nitrate being smuggled, or somehow smuggled, officially smuggled into the Lebanese Beirut port to serve as a material to produce armaments or bombs for the Hezbollah. This is also a very widely spread version. So to go back to the one certain fact, which is the criminal negligence, the gross negligence of storing that material over there, everyone agrees, including the Lebanese president of the Republic and all the Lebanese authorities that have spoken about this explosion, that there is negligence on the part of the authorities, the Lebanese authorities. The victims feel, and they are correct in feeling so, that being the direct suspect of this explosion, even though maybe not the only one, but this is a certain suspect. There is absolutely no question that the Lebanese authorities' negligence led to this explosion. So how can the suspect be in charge of the investigation? It's just, the conflict of interest is huge. That's why most I mean, I don't want to say most of the victims, because we have more than 300,000 victims in the sense of displaced, in the sense of people who have sustained damages. Victims in general do not believe that whoever is responsible of this blast could be trusted to investigate on the responsibilities. That's why a group of victims reached out to me and asked me that I submit in their name an official request to the UN Security Council asking for a resolution to immediately send a fact-finding mission and to refer the matter to the ICC, the International Criminal Court. Lebanon is not a member party to the International Criminal Court, so we do need a resolution of the Security Council to refer that matter to the International Criminal Court, or alternatively to ask the Security Council to create a special court, a special international prosecution for that purpose. Between parentheses, I do represent victims before the Special Tribunal for Lebanon that rendered its judgment a few days ago in The Hague in the matter of the assassination of the former Prime Minister Hariri. This judgment has, in my view and in the view of a lot of people, it has proven that the lack of proper investigation leads to impunity and to not being able to determine who the culprits are. Because in that judgment, there is a clear reference to the tampering with the crime scene and how the Lebanese authorities try to just go and clean the place right after the explosion. And this is what we saw now in the Beirut explosion. The Lebanese government wouldn't even refer the matter to through the proper Lebanese channels to the judiciary to start the investigation until the chair of the Beirut Bar Association, so it's the chair of the Lawyers Association, asked them to do that and exerted a lot of pressure. So because of all these factors, the Lebanese people, in whose name I speak at least, do not trust a Lebanese overseen investigation. We have investigators that have been sent by the French judiciary. We have the FBI who also came over. I read that we have also investigators from Germany, and the Russians have sent also some technicians, but this does not provide any assurance to the Lebanese victims who are seeking an international investigation, because this keeps the oversight and the coordination of the investigation within the hands of the Lebanese authorities, who have every interest in the world to escape any punishment. So that's where we are right now. We've sent letters to the ambassadors of the 5 permanent members in the UN, of course, the United Kingdom being one of the 5 permanent members in the UN Security Council, and the 10 other members who are members for 2 years, as I'm sure everyone knows. And since then, the group of victims has now become more than 1,000. They've created a website where one can sign electronically and endorse the petition. The website is victimsofbeirutmassacre.com. And I'm told that there are now more than 1,000 victims actively asking for the international investigation. We will be also trying to push some other pressure buttons at the United Nations, whether through the Human Rights Council or asking for there is a special meeting type at the United Nations that members can ask for this meeting, and we can submit evidence and testimonies from victims. This is where we are right now.
I'll make sure I put that website in the chat box for people to click on if they want to access that resource. But thank you very much, Nada, for fleshing out some of the disinformation that's been disseminated around Lebanon, international news. I remember reading the fireworks report myself and thinking that really doesn't make sense. So really glad to have you here, to have that voice coming directly from there, who can flesh out what's really happening. So Aya, could we go to you for your initial thoughts next?
Sure, thanks so much for having me. So as you said in your introduction, I represent Human Rights Watch. I'm their Lebanon researcher. And immediately after the blast happened, we had an internal meeting and made the decision to make a call for an international investigation, because we thought that the Lebanese judiciary was actually incapable of effectively investigating the Beirut blast and prosecuting those responsible. And I can walk you through some of our thinking and the reasons why we made this determination. So, first, the judiciary in Lebanon lacks independence. For years, we've been documenting serious concerns regarding the training, independence, and impartiality of the judiciary. The system for the appointment of judges undermines the court's independence and impartiality because of the extensive influence of the executive branch in the selection and appointment of judges. The highest judicial council in Lebanon also doesn't have financial independence, as its funds are allocated to it annually through the budget of the Ministry of Justice. In 2018, the UN Human Rights Committee expressed concern about political pressure reportedly exerted on the judiciary, particularly in the appointment of key prosecutors and investigating judges, and about allegations that politicians use their influence to protect supporters from prosecution. And unfortunately, Human Rights Watch has been documenting for years the way that the Lebanese judiciary has acted in ways that further the interests of political and religious groups in the country. Almost every investigation that we have done into human rights abuses in Lebanon has a section on the failure of the judiciary to protect against these abuses. For example, for years we've been documenting the judiciary's failure to prosecute and hold accountable members of the security forces who are engaged in torture. We've documented a litany of cases in which the judiciary either did not act on a direct criminal complaint filed by individuals who claim to have been tortured, or conducted the torture investigations in ways that are contrary to Lebanon's anti-torture law and to Lebanon's obligations under international law. As a result, impunity for torture in Lebanon remains rampant. We've also been documenting the failure of the Lebanese judiciary to prosecute politicians and others involved in corruption. Yet they're quick to prosecute journalists and activists for calling out corruption and for criticizing public officials. Unfortunately, this investigation into the Beirut blast has not been any different, and the judiciary seems to be conducting business as usual. The government referred this case to a special court with no appeals process, violating fundamental due process and fair trial rights. The appointment of the judicial investigator who heads the investigation has also been incredibly opaque, despite how important this judicial investigator is going to be for accountability in the country. 2 judges were rejected for the post over what many in the country say were political considerations. The judge who was appointed doesn't seem to have a good track record. He has shown clear political bias in his judgments. He's shown deference for security agencies. He's shown through at least one case that he's susceptible to political pressure. And he was a judge in the military court that we, Human Rights Watch, have been criticizing for years for failing to meet very basic international standards and due process rights. So far, this judge has not shown any inclination to look into the political system that made the Beirut blast possible. 3 weeks into the blast, he hasn't summoned in a single political official or minister for investigation. Instead, the investigation has centered around port officials who seem to be set to be scapegoated for the explosion. Port officials have been placed under house arrest and others have been arrested, but all the information available to the public is from media leaks. The government and the judiciary have not made any announcements on the number of officials who have been arrested, their names, and what the charges against them are. In another particularly egregious example, investigative journalists showed proof that documents were being removed from the Ministry of Public Works on the Sunday following the blast. The advisor and the minister the advisor to the Minister of Public Works and the Minister of Public Works both gave conflicting accounts of what the documents are and refused to hand over video evidence from inside the ministry. Yet, despite the importance of this development, given that the Ministry of Public Works oversees the port, the judiciary has not acted on this information. And then finally, as Neda was discussing, there's just a lack of public trust and credibility in the ability of any Lebanese process to truly deliver accountability and justice to the Lebanese people. So those are some of the reasons why Human Rights Watch has been calling for an international investigation into the blast. And perhaps a bit later in the discussion, you can go through what some of the options for an international investigation are and what an international investigation could look like.
Definitely. And so, as you've said, it's essentially one of those shoot the messenger scenarios. Anyone who reports on it is quashed, and there's such a conflict of interest, as both of you have essentially painted a very damning indictment of the lack of due process, the lack of impartiality, the impunity with which anyone responsible is running free, and the lack of information, credible information actually disseminated to victims and residents. So Wayne, could we go to you next for your initial thoughts on international investigation and the blast itself?
Yes, certainly, Satya. And can I begin by thanking you very much indeed for organising this discussion, because I think it is sad, but we've all seen the attention of the world being focused, very, very intently on what has happened in Beirut, but then quickly the media moves elsewhere. And I think it's extremely important that not just during the next few days and weeks, but over the next few months and years, our attention continues to be focused on Lebanon. I think Nadia has given a full explanation of many of the developments of the last few weeks. But I would like to stress that this was a totally unprecedented explosion. You yourself said in the introduction that it is probably the largest conventional non-nuclear blast there's been in the world ever. And it's important to recognize that such an event doesn't just happen. It's not merely an accident. We have to look very, very carefully and recognize there are certain factors and circumstances, perhaps peculiar to Lebanon, which allowed this huge amount of ammonium nitrate to be concentrated in the port in Beirut. So I think that we, first of all, ought to have an inquiry as a matter of principle, because this event was quite unprecedented in human history. But I think it's also very important that if we accept the principle of an inquiry, that we should be equally resolute and say that it's not appropriate really for the Lebanese judiciary to conduct such an inquiry. We often talk about corruption and systems not working properly, but I think the situation in Lebanon is particularly acute because the judicial system, as far as I've been told and as far as I can see, is fundamentally flawed and ridden with non-judicial elements, and there's little justice. everything is beholden to sectarian considerations, whether it be of a political kind or a religious kind. And I think that's borne out by the fact there's been so many demonstrations, not just over the last few weeks, but really over the last few months since really the end of the civil war. And I think that that's an indictment of the judicial system, but it's also an indictment of the government. And I know the government has resigned, and some people saying, well, there'll be a fundamental change, therefore. You'll have a new government coming elected, a new brush will sweep clean. But my understanding of the situation in Lebanon is that what we're likely to see is a game also of musical chairs, because it strikes me that as a political class which is holding the reins of power, and it's the same individuals more or less who are holding the power, whatever kind of government you have under the current system. And therefore I think that it's quite important that we recognize that it's neither desirable or plausible or feasible that an inquiry is conducted by the structures which exist in Lebanon today. It has to be an international inquiry. And of course, there are plenty of players which would, I imagine, willingly conduct an inquiry. The FBI had been mentioned. Iran, I'm sure, would be more than happy to conduct an inquiry. And we've already seen some suggestions of a quite outlandish nature why this explosion took place, whether it's the fault of Israel or the CIA or whatever. And therefore, I think that it's important that no single nation has power in terms of an inquiry. It has to be an objective international body. And obviously, the best placed body with all its flaws is the United Nations. But I would just issue one word of caution. Reference has already been made as to what has happened in the Hague of the United Nations trial of an explosion which took place in 2005 in Lebanon, which a former prime minister was killed. And that took 15 years to come to its conclusion. Well, I think it's absolutely imperative that we are talking about a relatively short time scale here. And that necessitates, I think, our discussion to be focusing on a practical mechanism which would deliver justice fairly and quickly. And I think that's important not just for people who take an interest in Lebanon, but mostly it's important for the people who live in Lebanon themselves, because there's a tremendous discontent, as we all know, in Lebanon, and people want to see change brought about. And I think the surest way to bring about the start of that process of change will be to have an objective inquiry into how this explosion took place.
Thank you, Wayne. Some great points there about what an inquiry could look like, and the fact that it must not just be one singular nation that conducts it, and especially doing it with the expediency that is commensurate with the scale of the disaster. So Anna, could we go to you next for your initial thoughts as well?
Yes, thank you. And I'd also like to really thank you for getting us together to discuss this. I think one of the most important things is, you know, in the aftermath, you know, there are articles, discussions. We mustn't forget that the situation, the dire situation in Lebanon has been going on for a long, long time. And we need to make sure that at the very least, the international community comes together and we do look at ways of resolving this and changing the status quo. We know that this blast was a symptom of state negligence. It exposed its poor governance, but what has really struck me actually, and in many of my meetings that I've had, discussions I've had with NGOs on the ground, is it's highlighted such strength of goodwill amongst the people who are there, the Lebanese themselves, the people, not those in power, And in the aftermath of the blast, we witnessed the Lebanese people themselves taking to the streets, coupled with civil society to tend to displace, to, just the day after, to coordinate rehousing, clear debris, organise community kitchens. The people have stepped up where the state has not. And that's an issue in itself. But we can also look at the fact that this voluntary community has thrived simply because of the same shortcomings which allowed this explosion to take place. A dysfunctional state failed to provide and to protect its people. As I've said, as Wayne said, Lebanon was already on the brink of collapse with sustained international action, chaos and disaster will reign, plunging existing humanitarian, refugee, health, economic and political frailties to new lows. So it's so important that the international community works together to support and stabilise Lebanon, but that we have that independent investigation. We know Lebanon was already struggling to deal with the pressure of hosting over 1.5 million refugees from Syria and Palestine, a quarter of which live in Beirut. Refugees actually make up 30% of the Lebanese population. And actually, out of those killed in the blast, 34 were registered as refugees, which were almost a quarter of the total deaths. But we're seeing around, I think, figures of around 43,000 migrants and refugees affected by the explosion. So we need that independent investigation as an important part of the process towards re-establishing trust amongst the general population, the people. That is so integral towards the national healing. As has been said, people feel hugely let down, and untangling years of domestic rule by impunity is incredibly difficult. But the size and the shock of this explosion has shaken the status quo, and I think it's up to us, up to the international community to make sure that independent investigation happens quickly and efficiently, and justice is done so that further danger is avoided and that people are listened to. So the people there who are demanding that action, who are there helping the people where the authorities are not, are listened to and acted on, and that there is full and clear transparency. That's what I want to see, a proper national healing. Without it, it will be difficult, I think, for Lebanon to be able to tackle the humanitarian, the social, the economic issues without this establishment of trust. So that is an international community coming together to be fully invested in supporting and stabilising the country and therefore helping the most vulnerable.
Thank you, Anna. Some incredible points that very much hit the nail on the head there from a broader perspective in terms of how people have stepped up, where the state has not, as you said, couldn't have put it better myself. The positives that could come out of this in terms of perhaps the system being able to be revolutionized and become fairer, more inclusive and more transparent, and of course more accountable, and highlighting how proportionate measures are needed and quickly. So George, last but not least, for our sort of first thoughts, could we come to you?
Thank you for hosting me. I would like first to reiterate what Aya has said and what Nada have said, and basically both of them share like the same perspective of how we see about the situation. As Aleph, we have been working for more than a decade now to monitor human rights violations, particularly human rights violations affecting the right to a fair trial. And we look a lot at detention issues, at torture prevention, at the independence of the judiciary. And like, in light of the events in Beirut and in light of the blast that happened, we cannot simply consider or like oversee and forget about the years of advocacy we have done, the years of documentation, and the number of victims that have witnessed unfairness and violation through that system. Saying that, meaning that we cannot suddenly consider that this same system can deal actually with the investigation and the prosecution of this bombing or this blast. We cannot simply forget suddenly that even in petty crimes, even in small incidents, the law enforcement agencies, the prosecution is unable to actually deal with these issues. Even weeks ago, Lebanon was in the middle of a tug of war between the executive and the judiciary over the nomination of the new judges. And we clearly saw how the Ministry of Justice, or currently the former Ministry of Justice, the President of the Republic and his advisors were actually trying to meddle into the nomination from the Higher Judicial Council in order to nominate judges and prosecutors that actually serve their agenda. We cannot simply just put this all aside now when the bombing took place. So when we call for an independent international inquiry, it actually comes at a time where there's complete lack of trust in how the system can function. And also not just from human rights organizations that have been calling for that for years, but also a lack of political will from the MPs in Lebanon, from the executive, in order to put in place proper reforms to the judiciary and to the law enforcement agencies. The UK has been one of the generous donors that have actually worked closely on security sector reform, that has worked also closely with the EU and other actors in order to provide support and technical advice to the Lebanese judiciary, has provided support to NGOs in order to advocate for, and civil society organizations at large, in order to provide advocacy and research on how to advance the independence of judiciary. All these findings clearly say to us that the judiciary, either in prosecution or in the law enforcement, are not independent enough to actually manage that, and not impartial. Aleph has recently published today actually a position paper setting up all these arguments. I will share them with both Cecilia and Alex in order to share it with the wider group and make it available, where we set out all these arguments. And they all resonate around what Aya has said, around the incapacity, the incompetence of this judiciary to deal with this event. But it also sets up also to what the victims actually want in this process. I'm not pushing for a transitional justice kind of process when it comes to that, because these kind of event needs proper accountability. But there is a need to have this form of truth and reconciliation with the Lebanese citizens, between the polity and between the citizens. We need guarantees of non-repetition. Maybe this is what Your Excellency, Ms. Anna, you have mentioned, maybe in the national healing kind of sense. But currently, the Lebanese citizens and all the victims, whether they are Lebanese residents, Lebanese citizens, or even migrant workers and refugees, actually need proper answers to what happened. They need to be reconciled to the authorities that have let them go. As Maître Nada has said, it's a crime of negligence. In that sense, looking at since at least 2 years or 3 years, we have seen Lebanon sliding more into instability. If we would like to see Lebanon stable, and if the international community, the UK particularly, wants to see Lebanon stable again, it all goes back to having strong judiciary, having resolution of what happened, and having proper accountability and guarantees of non-repetitions. With the absence of this, I don't think we can actually turn on the page and have stability again. Over the years, the international community, I think, has been invested in superficial stability. For human rights organization, I don't think it's something new. It goes within our theory of change, let's say, is that we cannot achieve stability in Lebanon when there's still human rights violations occurring on day-to-day basis. The cases of torture are always happening. The perpetrators are never held to account. The recourse to the military tribunal is still happening on day-to-day basis. We can even see it in the aftermath of the blast, where there has been also this challenge about whether the military tribunal should be dealing with the case or the judicial council. Unfortunately, both of them are terrible forms of justice. One of them is a where it's a non-independent court, basically created from military officers, assisted by civilian judges, basically where we have a record number of violations that happen in these courts. The other one is a court of one instance, basically with no right to appeal, where we have basically around 250 cases were sent to it since establishment, and basically none of them were properly resoluted. So we're stuck between a rock and a hard place, where we have to choose between two forms of justice that are actually are basically a non-functioning, incompetent, not independent, cannot provide a fair trial to the suspects. And this is why I think, despite maybe it's several criticism in politics or in practice to the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, we cannot deny the fact that it does provide the proper equality of arms, the proper access to a fair trial to everyone that participate in the process. And I think this is why we call for an independent international inquiry. An independent inquiry cannot create like the morning after in Lebanon. Like it's a big workshop that civil society needs to be present with, that the Bar Association needs to be present with, the judges, political parties, the government needs to be active in. We're really happy to see that there's now the judges clubs or the judges association in order to also represent the judiciary in these conversations. This all cannot happen overnight, and in the current climate of shrinking space of freedom of association, of freedom of expression, as Aya has said, with journalists and activists being arrested, taken to court, some of them taken to military tribunals, we cannot actually participate in this workshop. And this is our concern as human rights organization, is that we have to deal with the prosecution and the investigation of the blast, while we're also taking care of what kind of democratic space needs to be put in place in order to be engaged in the reforms that the Lebanese are in need of prior even to the international community. I will not repeat to what all other speakers have said, but I think because as a Lebanese NGO, I'm speaking to a UK audience, I think my message, just to end what my intervention, is basically what kind of debate or what kind of engagement should the UK have with the Lebanese decision makers starting today around the blast, whether around the prosecution, around the investigation, but also the reforms that are needed. And I think it's very important if stability is being prioritized in the relationship with Lebanon. I think from a human rights perspective, stability can never be achieved while there's no proper track record in human rights. Yes, sometimes human rights should be a conditionality to any kind of like dialogue or like relationship or bilateral agreements with the executive. And it's for us really important at this stage. And like the crime of negligence that has occurred is a clear sense that this balance between this trade-off between keeping Lebanon stable and actually advancing human rights, or like advancing accountability, advancing transparency, there's really a need to actually tip the balance more to the side of accountability, of transparency, and having like a proper human rights track record for Lebanon. And that's it. Thanks.
Thanks very much, George, for that. I just want to say to the audience, we've now opened up questions. So if you have questions, please type them into the box and they'll be voted on. And the most popular questions will be asked to our panelists. Going to our next question, I think all of our panelists have touched upon this. The last 2 years have been tumultuous years in Lebanon's history. And Lebanon is now experiencing a triple crisis: a political crisis, an economic crisis, and now with accelerating COVID rates, a public health crisis. And this blast was sort of the nadir of the last 2 years. Just when people thought Lebanon's situation couldn't get any worse, the blast occurred and it has got worse. And so I guess taking a step back and sort of asking another fundamental question: what politically needs to shift in Lebanon for real change to occur? We've all mentioned that the Lebanese authorities are not entrusted themselves to conduct the investigation. And part of that is because, as Aya and George have said, they're not impartial, and there's deep-rooted corruption within the judiciary and the executive. So I guess the next question is, if Lebanon moves forward, what politically needs to change? And will a new government be sufficient, or does Lebanon require a new constitution and an end to the sectarian system? To kick us off with that very large question, can I please go to Aya?
That is a very large question.
No pressure.
I'll preface this by saying that, as an international human rights organizations, we don't usually take political positions in a country. So our main concerns are that the government be accountable to its population, that there be clear, independent, impartial state institutions that are able to uphold the rule of law. In Lebanon's case, unfortunately, what we've seen time and time again is that the people, as I think Wayne termed it, the government in Lebanon is just, game of magical chairs. They're the same people just rotating out into and out of government. The same political parties have been controlling the country for, since the end of the civil war practically. So really there needs to be, Lebanon is a parliamentarian system. So Parliament appoints the Prime Minister appoints the cabinet, and it's approved by the president. So there's a lot of power given to Parliament. So I think slowly people are realizing that there needs to be, people are starting to mobilize, people are starting to develop alternative political agendas that are not rooted in the sectarian system. They are starting to develop, clear ideologies and positions on issues. They're starting to do grassroots organization, mobilization, getting ready for the next elections in 2 years. Because every government that's appointed now has to be agreed on by Parliament, which is the same political parties that have ruled the country for years. They're the same political parties that have appointed the last 2 governments. So we're not going to see any real change from any cabinet or any prime minister and cabinet that's appointed by the current parliamentary makeup. So really, for us, it's over the next 2 years, how do we ensure that there is electoral competition? How do we ensure that there is an independent judiciary that's able to look into, issues of, uphold the rule of law in the country? How do we make sure that people who are corrupt are held accountable? How do we make sure that people who plundered state resources for years are held accountable? Those are from a international human rights organization. Those are our priorities for the country. Who is then, the particular names who are put in place to lead the government really fall outside of our mandate.
Thanks very much, Aya, for that. And perhaps taking a different perspective, an international perspective, Wayne, can you speak about, do you think the blast has made a fundamental shift in how the international community approaches Lebanon? Previously, the international community, they called on Lebanon to reform, but they didn't take the next step, which is saying that the actual constitution or the sectarian system needs to change itself. Do you think the blast has changed that calculation?
I think it's been an eye-opener to the international community as a whole. But there are already, to be honest with you, extremely worrying signs. Because, for example, soon after the blast, we saw the French President McMorrin, come to Beirut, and everybody thought this was the beginning of something big that's going to happen. But I've been looking at his comments since, and it seems quite depressing, to be perfectly honest, because he seems to be talking about the creation of a new government of national unity. In other words, business as usual, gets with a few changes here and there. And I think that the situation is such that that's nowhere near good enough, because I think that we have to deal with the situation as it exists at the moment, and there's tremendous upsurge support from the international community in terms of aid. Much of it bypasses, thankfully, the established and corrupt structures which are in place. But I think there's a need to go a step further than that and look at it at the medium and long term. Now, my view is, and it's very easy to say, What we need in Lebanon is a new state structure, new state apparatus, a new judicial system, a new politics, and a new constitution. If we lived in an ideal world, that's what we'd be campaigning for, but that is completely unrealistic in my view. And I think that we have to look towards incremental change, not least because although there have been large demonstrations in the country, in Beirut in particular, civil society is relatively weak there. And enshrined in the constitution is representation from the 18 religious sects, some people call them, 18 religious communities. And they've got automatic election, and there's a new electoral system in place introduced just a couple of years ago, which makes it very, very difficult for independents to be elected and to break that logjam which exists. But nevertheless, I think the international community must try to do that. And it's a very difficult debate that we'll have to start. The IMF is still in the process of negotiating support, and they want changes to be brought about before their commitments will be made real. But I think the international community as a whole, certainly Western countries, need to get together and speak with one voice. Now, to be honest with you, it is much easier, I think, when we were part of the European Union to be able to cooperate with our French partners, for example. But nevertheless, despite Brexit, we have to get together with our European partners to make sure that Britain is part of that European effort to bring about change. And I think the first opportunity is in those elections in 2 years' time. And I think we should be urging them as most support possible for the election of independents who will be outside of the traditional representation and will take the agenda forward in terms of reforming the state and ultimately reforming the constitution. But let's be honest, this is extremely difficult to achieve, not least because the largest political voice in Lebanon today is Hezbollah. And I mean, frankly, they got very little interest in independents being elected. And I think that there's some pretty hard issues which have to be confronted if we're serious about bringing about this kind of radical change.
Thanks very much for that perspective, Wayne. Perhaps moving to what Lebanon civil society can do. You, George, can answer this question. A lot of the demonstrators in Lebanon from October to after the blast, they have called for grand change and sweeping change and the abolition of the sectarian system and getting rid of the elite. What do you think role civil society can play and local organizations in, as Wayne said, not perhaps, this is, might be pie in the sky, but perhaps incrementally changing the system? Yeah, please.
Thank you, Alex. My opinion on that might not be a very popular opinion. I might not make a lot of friends after it, but Lebanon, like a friend called it recently in an article, Lebanon is in need of an inevitable mutation. I wouldn't be simplifying it into looking at sectarianism or secularism as a recipe for that. I think it oversimplifies the problems in Lebanon, and like basically forms of identity politics could be present while respecting rule of law and having accountability. It's not that I'm a proponent of it, but I wouldn't want to simplify that give the magic recipe that if like Lebanon becomes a secular state, that means we won't have any more corruption or accountability, or those kind of events and blasts and negligence won't happen and won't reoccur. It's a bit unrealistic in my opinion. However, what is needed is certainly a revision of the social contract that is present. And unfortunately, there isn't any social contract in Lebanon currently. Like since at least 2005, the social contract has been like constantly in revision. And like basically, there isn't one way to do it. And this is a bit like for me to reiterate or like to focus on the point or emphasize on that the message of like sectarianism versus secularism is not going to like solve Lebanon's problem, either the electricity or the corruption or the trust of the citizen in the social welfare. What is needed is certainly some kind of mutation and reform to how the day-to-day and governance is taking place. And I think this is where civil society has to be much more engaged with. And I think this is also like a self-criticism for someone that has worked in the sector and has advocated and been an activist as a volunteer or as a full-time job for quite some time now. As a self-criticism, I think we do suffer from this Peter Pan syndrome of like, we don't want to actually play in the big game. We just want to stay on our side as an entity that is a watchdog that just criticizes government policy and like issues these reports. But you also need to start playing a strong game and like basically start speaking politics and start taking out the gloves and start speaking things the way they are and start to be engaged in advocacy and policy reforms and start understanding what is the current political landscape. We cannot expect that the debate now is in the policy agenda, and what we need is creating draft laws and push them through parliament and then wait for them to be implemented, while the issue is not even on the agenda. We need to create this agenda, and I think this is where civil society needs to be more engaged. We need to understand why are these things not functioning, stop focusing on just creating legal reforms and like just sitting and just waiting for 10 MPs in Lebanon to accept a legal reform that we have drafted in our NGO offices and like let them go through. We need to understand why they are not working. What are the behavioral change that needs to happen at the societal level, but also at the decision-making level? What are the other ways to solve them in policies, in politics, etc. We need to speak that. And this is also one concern of the demonstrations that took place. And this is where basically this is another like a bit of a not very popular opinion, but like basically the protest movement didn't provide any political agenda for the Lebanese citizens in order to actually challenge the current polity or the current elites and the establishment. And that's the biggest concern, if you want, because and the results in the elections, the results also in the municipal elections in 2016 and in the parliamentary election in 2018 indicate that there's not yet a political message. And let me say very frankly, many of the independent groups say things that are very obvious, but this is not where the policy debate is. Yeah, everyone wants public parks. Everyone wants accountability. There's no political group that will like basically lead a campaign that is pro corruption. Everyone is anti-corruption. What is needed is why do we have corruption, and target that. And the reason, the last thing I want to say is that accountability and anti-corruption also stems from us as individuals, as citizens in the first place. We also and Alex, you have lived in Lebanon for a while, and you also have experienced that. As citizens, we also take the shortcuts, and we also encourage forms of corruption that is present. We also accept accountability for some, and we consider it a conspiracy when it's for someone we know or someone close to us. So this also needs a cultural change. This is why it's this inevitable mutation that needs to be happen. But just the last message, and this is also coming back to us as civil society, is that we need to start be serious, and we have been so much in our comfort zone, presenting recommendations that some of the time are a bit unrealistic, and sometimes very 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 high up. We need to start providing recommendations that are political in nature. And the problem, this is very uncomfortable for us as human rights NGO, because this is not really our role, but we lack think tanks in Lebanon. We lack think tanks that, similar to the Fabian Society, will sit with Labour MPs, will provide them with the situation, will sit with conservative MPs, will explain to them in their own languages. And we lack these think tanks. Like think tanks that are present in Lebanon, unfortunately, provide the same recommendations and messages and research that is the role of development agencies and human rights agencies. But we need someone to sit in the back rooms with politicians, with political groups, and speak this uncomfortable message of why corruption is bad for you as a political party. And that if you want to run for elections, this is what you need to be doing. And this is lacking, unfortunately. And this is why when you meet your counterparts, whether through the all-party parliamentary group for Lebanon and others, and there's a Lebanese delegation that comes, you find that most of the debate over policy is superficial to a large extent, because the MPs are not prepped, they don't have the grasp of the situation. They haven't been prepped by their think tanks about why a trip to the UK is important, why you need to create those networks. Yeah.
Thanks very much, George. And I think, you know, for me, the one thing that came out of that was the importance of engagement within the political system in Lebanon, and how any reform or change in the future will necessarily come about by an aware citizenry engaging in the political system and voting for candidates that are both independent and read up on their brief. I wonder, Nada, how you see Lebanon going in the future, and whether you think that this is possible, and that the protest movement, both last year and after the blast, has created this aware citizenry, or do you think that Lebanon, unfortunately, will get a lot darker before it gets lighter?
First of all, I start by agreeing fully with what Aya said and what George said. And allow me to bring us back to the situation where we are today. We have a capital that is bleeding literally, not just as a figurative way of speaking. 20 days after the blast, some corpses are being still discovered, some are still missing. People are dying day after day, some are still in coma. People don't have houses, don't have shelters, don't know where to go, lost an eye, an ear, a hand. I mean, we are bleeding, and it's now the time to help us get to the bottom of this crime. It's a crime. We have mentioned negligence so many times during this webinar, starting by me. This is the established fact, is the existence of criminal negligence. However, more is there. There is more than meet the eye. And if we don't have if we don't get to the truth of what happened, forget about policy reform, forget about change in Lebanon, forget about any future for Lebanon. 350,000 person, which is literally half of the, or one third of the population of the capital, is injured, is damaged one way or the other. If this is not gonna shake the the international public opinion, and get us the support to help us get out of this incredible situation in which we are. Lebanon is not a parliamentarian system. It's not a presidential system. It's not a democracy. It's not an oligarchy. It's a kleptocracy. We are run by thieves. Kleptocracy. Kleptocrats are stealing everything in this country, the money, the resources, and now they're stealing their lives. They stole the lives of all these victims who died in this massacre. It's a real massacre. It's beyond anything that I can even explain or show you. So the starting point is uncovering the truth. And the more time it's dragging, the less truth we're gonna find. And the less truth we're gonna find, the less hope, the less change, nothing is going to happen. So that's why I urge you, all the people who are listening to us, and thank you so much for the Fabian Society and for your interest in organizing this webinar. Please support us. Go to our, the victims' Facebook page, support them. Go to Human Rights Watch, support them. Go to Aleph, support them. We need your support. Liking the page, supporting us, putting pressure by creating, by organizing these events, and reaching out to the decision makers, to your governments, to your MPs. And we're honored, to have two very active and prominent MPs and shadow ministers right in the heart of the subject. We need to uncover the truth. And the truth is going to uncover the criminals, the assassins who are responsible for the 100,000 lives that have been affected by that. It's beyond any any example that I would have imagined of corruption killing people. It's grand corruption. It's a scandal of grand corruption massacring people. I am an international human rights lawyer, yes, but I am also a transparency and anti-corruption militant since 1999. I mean, the last time I saw Aya was when we were at Harvard speaking about the garbage crisis at Harvard in a conference, just explaining how corruption is putting the country, drowning the country in garbage. Today, corruption is drowning us in blood. Please support us to uncover the truth and to have this independent fact-finding mission. These criminals, no matter who they are, from the head of the pyramid to the smallest person, they ought to be judged and punished and go to jail and get out of these seats in which they comfortably sit because of this kleptocratic system that we have in Lebanon.
Thanks, Nada, for that. And I wonder, Anna, if what Nada has said is true, and nothing will happen unless there's a transparent and impartial and effective investigation into the blast. What concrete steps should the UK, in your view, take? And what concrete steps should the Labour Party take in leading on this issue within the UK?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you heard from Nada the emotion with which you speak, Nada, which is and the power with which you speak. And I think that is so telling. And it also, there's a responsibility on all of us, and us as parliamentarians, on both Wayne and myself. We are in opposition, but we have a responsibility to be pressing our government, the UK government, to do absolutely everything within an international response to ensure that, firstly, there's an immediate and quick investigation into what went on, but then to make sure that it is not the status quo that stays within Lebanon. We know that bad governance has created the deep, deep humanitarian, social, economic challenges, and now this is coupled with a power vacuum and a toxic mix. But we know that removal of one system, and we've seen that the government resigned, but what's there instead? They're still there. They are there as a caretaker government, and you know, we know that if there are elections, that will they be fair elections? Will they just come back in? The international community, in my view, cannot be overbearing, but then we have an absolute responsibility to help manage change. And I, you know, like Wayne, I was really optimistic in seeing and boosted by seeing Macron get there quickly and show that leadership. But then it has turned into nothing. He's talking about the same, a coalition government, which is going to be more of the same. And we know that, you know, this is the toxicity within the system there. The fact that the people of Lebanon do not have a voice. And I think George expressed it incredibly well. Without the political understanding, without the policy, without the way forward, how will the people of Lebanon manage to find their way through into the political elite? And the next steps, and that's what's needed, and that is for the international community, for the UK government, alongside other international responses, to step up, not to intervene unnecessarily, but to show that leadership, to work with civic society, to work with those NGOs on the ground, to work with people there with you on the ground, to find those responses and make sure that systemic change is a route to progress. And we've seen from, we know too well from the Arab Spring that systemic change isn't necessarily a route to progress. We need to see that route to progress, freedom, prosperity, And I hope for particularly where the state institutions, when they remain so entrenched in the system that they get outside of it, and that we can see those freedoms coming. But for that, people need to know how to do it. The Lebanese people need to know what the next steps are. And that's where the international community, that's where the UK government can really step up to help. And that's what I want to see. The Labour Party and we as Labour will be putting pressure on the UK government to do that. Mindful that we're not overbearing within domestic affairs, but also making sure that where help is needed, it's given.
Thank you very much, Anna, for that pledge of solidarity. And I can say, at least in terms of the Fabians, we absolutely are behind you and are behind any effort whatsoever to push for that transparency and that accountability. And I think as a panel, you've come to a very unanimous consensus on the international investigation needed for stabilization, the fact that the judiciary is at the epicenter of this disaster, it's integral to it. We need substance, not superficiality. And as Nada said and outlined, the complete ridiculous conflict of interest that makes the Lebanese government conducting this an absolute farce. And as Aya said, the kind of human rights abuses that were going on way before this, that Human Rights Watch documented. Wayne making a great point about how it can't be one singular nation, as Anna echoed, it must be neutral. And what is requisite for national healing? The tug of war between the executive and the judiciary is unacceptable, and it can't carry on. And George made a great point in terms of the protesters are rightfully protesting, but they're not necessarily putting out there those pledges that we need to see in terms of what their demands are. So like Extinction Rebellion, an environmental activist group here, for example, put out pledges that a lot of parliamentarians signed in terms of exactly what their asks were to remediate this, and in terms of the Lebanese situation, win back credibility instead of, as Nada said, being a kleptocracy. So thank you all for those second round of thoughts. And I just wanted to move to an audience question coming from John Newham. So he asked things from quite a pragmatic perspective. So who should establish the investigating body? How then can it conduct its work and put forward recommendations for implementation? He said he agrees with all of you, but worries that justice would prove elusive. So I wanted to start with you, Nada, in terms of your recommendations. Nada, you're muted, hang on. Just unmute yourself. Don't worry, there's always one.
I'm sorry. The one of the routes is for one of the permanent members of the UN Security Council to put on the agenda a resolution, suggest a resolution at the upcoming meeting, and put it for vote and discussion to establish an inquiry, an independent inquiry commission. And this is what the request of the victims is calling for. There are many requests that were made in that sense, by the community at large, and one of them has now gathered, I think, more than 80,000 e-signatures, but it's not from the victims. So this is in addition to what the victims themselves are asking for. I know that the first ones I think they were the first NGO to ask for an independent inquiry. It was Human Rights Watch, I think so. And so the primary ask and the shortcut and the most efficient one is for the UN Security Council to appoint and name and send a fact-finding inquiry mission. If this doesn't work, or if this seems complicated and you have the veto power in the UN Security Council, another thing that is very worthy of consideration is to have the UN Human Rights Council establish an independent inquiry also, or fact-finding mission. This can be done by a majority decision, so there is no veto power in at that level. And we've seen this happen in a number of situations where there were flagrant human rights crimes. So these are two very practical steps that can be done. I think also that Aya mentioned other alternatives that they were also recommending. So I would love to hear that as well from her.
Perfect transition. Straight over to you, Aya.
Thank you. So in addition to the two avenues for international scrutiny into the Beirut blast that Nada outlined, there are two others that could also be potential avenues. The first is the special procedures route. So the special procedures are a group of UN experts with specific mandates that could lead an investigation into this issue. There's actually a special rapporteur with exactly a mandate to look into something like the Beirut blast. He's called the Special Rapporteur on the Implications for Human Rights of the Environmentally Sound Management and Disposal of Hazardous Substances and Waste. Bit of a mouthful, but his mandate, we've already been in touch with him, and he sees the Beirut explosion, Beirut blast, as falling within his mandate. He and several other special rapporteurs released a statement last week reiterating the need for a prompt, impartial, credible, and independent investigation based on human rights principles, and they all indicated their willingness to support such an investigation. The other route would be for the UN Secretary General himself, through his office, to establish some kind of board of inquiry or commission of inquiry to look into this investigation. The downsides, however, of an international investigation would be access to the crime scene. So, as the STL has shown, for an investigation to truly be able to, get to the bottom of what happened, they would need access to the crime scene, they would need access to documents, they would need to be able to interview judges and political officials and port officials. So really, we've been trying to do advocacy both with the Lebanese government and with Lebanon's international donors to really put pressure on Lebanon to invite an international investigation, whatever that might look like, into the country, and give them unhindered access so that they're able to conduct a truly impartial and comprehensive investigation into the Beirut blast.
Thank you for outlining those other routes. So we've got, as Nada suggested, the simplistic UN fact-finding mission, a special rapporteur with a very, very long name, but with implications for human rights, and also a special commission itself, the barrier being actually accessing that key evidence. So Wayne, I wanted to go to you next in terms of John's question.
In terms of what is possible, in terms of the UN's procedures, I've got nothing specifically to add. I think that they've comprehensively been covered by the two previous speakers. What I think is important, however, is that both Anna and myself and others, when we get back to Parliament next week, get to the House of Commons Library to do some homework to find out which is the most desirable and the most feasible route to follow, and then to establish informal as well as formal communication of our government to make sure that they press hard for what is the best option. Because I think that to be perfectly honest, this is not something we would want to seek to have political capital out of. We try to have a bipartisan approach as far as is practicable, and encourage our own government to raise it strongly in the UN and pursue a most practical route, but also in cooperation of our neighbours as well. One other thing I'd add is that I think it's important that we try and extend the debate, as it were, as far as possible. And there's a number of routes open to us. There's the Friede Stiftung, which is extremely proactive in encouraging debate amongst social democrats and progressives in Europe. I think we could also encourage the IPU, the Interparliamentary Union, to take up this issue and make suggestions and have a dialogue as well to help to develop a degree of impetus. There's also the Party of European Socialists, which Britain is still a part of, although we've left the EU. And there's a conservative counterpart of that organisation as well. And I think all of us really need to go out from this this discussion to commit ourselves to make sure that we pursue the matter in earnest, in the best practicable way over the next few days.
Definitely. Wayne, you essentially stole my own closing question to you. So
Sorry.
That's all right. It was actually going to be very much centred around what a Labour MP, for example, could do. And so, Anna, I'll move to you, kind of echoing a little bit of that. Do you think Labour would, as a party, would come out backing an international investigation? What are your thoughts? Was obviously Wayne's kind of outlined some very practical steps to upping and ramping up that political pressure, and what do you envisage yourself doing in this effort?
Yeah, absolutely. I think everybody has made some very important points, but I think the critical thing here is that there are still people hurting on the ground. There is incredible suffering still taking place in Beirut and around, and the impact for me as Shadow Minister for International Development, the impact on the refugees there, the 1.5 million refugees that Lebanon hosts at the moment, the impact that this blast has had on both Syrian and Palestinian refugees, the hierarchy as well within the refugee system that has been felt prior to the blast has been appalling. So we know, and we've heard, or I've heard firsthand from refugees how they have felt second, third class citizens within the country. With the ports being affected and completely destroyed, hospitals destroyed, routes of aid now being destroyed, that really is putting huge pressure on the people there living. We know that they are suffering from huge food insecurities, really tremendous suffering going on there, as well as having lost people. So what I would say is that immediately the pressure needs to be on helping the international community, helping those people. And for me, as a shadow minister, it's putting pressure on the UK government to make sure that that aid is fairly and equally distributed and doesn't go in the pockets of people who are not going to be using it or using it for wrong means. But what I would also say is what we've been discussing here in terms of an open, transparent, independent investigation into what went on, and that needs to happen very, very fast. I want to see our government, and that's what I'll be working with Wayne, both of us will be putting pressure on our government, UK government, to support that independent investigation in whatever way it is best, and that needs to be quick. We've seen, actually, unfortunately, the UN take far too long with international investigations in other countries, in other areas. We need this to happen fast, and I want to see the international community and the UK showing some leadership, because we can show that leadership. It is sadly really missing at the moment. You know, the government, Dominic Raab, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, they pledged the money, but then we don't see it. We don't actually see the money, and we don't see the political leadership that is sadly lacking in our government. That's what we'll be pushing for. And as Wayne said, we'll be in the library looking at every which way to find out the best way forward for this.
Thank you so much, Anna. That's really, really good to hear, and great point on that equitable access to aid, which is transparently delivered. So last not but least, George, wanted to come to you on that main question, and then I think we've got one last one, which Alex will ask from someone from, a friend of his called Nick. So George, over to you.
I don't think I have anything to add on the main question, but I will take advantage of having the floor just to mention that it's a bit off the main topic of the question, but just to mention that all of this is happening in Lebanon at the time where Lebanon has introduced a state of emergency that is actually that has not respected the procedural safeguards or the legality of it. So we have to take into consideration that when it comes to civil society, and like linking it back to the answer to the question I answered earlier, that the civil society now is further at risk because of, like, we don't know how the military will use this jurisdiction in order to maintain security and stability in the country, especially in a country where we start with completely violating the laws and the constitution to extend the state of emergency. And we add to whatever Aya and Nada has spoken about when it comes to the malpractices into the system initially. I don't know what is the other question from Nick.
There is a different one which you're welcome to have a stab at, which was from Jawal. US and Israeli intelligence think that Hezbollah controls the Beirut port. They routinely stockpile weapons among the civilian population, including the port, in order to protect it from Israel attacks. It appointed President Michael Owen and Prime Minister Hassan Diab. So the question is, what can be done to disarm Hezbollah and improve the Lebanese situation?
I think I cannot answer on the allegations. Maybe I don't have the same access to information as the US and Israeli intelligence and the evidence and the triangulation, but I can simply say this is exactly why we need some kind of an inquiry in order to understand these things. As a human rights defender from Lebanon, I don't think I have the capacity or the tools or the resources to be able to answer that. As for the second part of the question, I think it's part of this whole democratic dialogue. It goes back to this dialogue that civil society, that citizens in Lebanon have to decide how they want to have a closure or like a conclusion to this issue. But as a human rights defender, I have no evidence about all these things, and it's really, we bring it up to the issue of the inquiry, and this is another evidence why an inquiry is actually needed.
Absolutely agreed. So Alex, over to you for a closing question and last remarks.
So this question's from Nick, and Nick works for the Daily Star in Lebanon. And I think it ties in neatly to what George has said about the need for independent investigation. And I know Nada, as a lawyer, will be familiar with the concept of vicarious liability. And that is, the people, the port officials, they are not just responsible for the blast, it goes way up to the height of government. So the next question, I think, is which Nick has asked, is this: how can a truly independent investigation with the mandate to implicate a system/parties and political elite, individuals who are part of the elite, be proposed and agreed upon by the very same political parties that potentially stand to lose from such an investigation? And I'm wondering whether Nada can start us off.
Exactly. I mean, because you do not expect the culprit to support an investigation that could potentially uncover their responsibility. This is why the best really avenue is for the UN Security Council to take a resolution under Chapter 7 of the Charter, of the UN Charter, sending an inquiry or a fact-finding mission, because then the government of Lebanon in that case has no right to object or to oppose the prerogatives and the authority of that fact-finding mission, because Lebanon, as a founding member of the charter of the UN, the current UN charter, has agreed in its sovereign will to comply with the convention. And Chapter 7 of the convention gives the right to the UN Security Council to impose such measures on any country, member country. So that would be the perfect way to circumvent the resistance of the political factions who know that they are guilty.
Thanks very much for that, Nada. Wayne and Anna, I was wondering whether you think, is there any chance of the UK using its influence and its vote on the Security Council and pushing for such a resolution? I know that Dominic Raab and they have pledged aid to Lebanon, humanitarian aid, but they haven't spoken very much about what concretely needs to be done in terms of the investigation and the UK's role on the Security Council. I was wondering what you think about that.
I think it's a very, very good point. I mean, the government has said very little in terms of political processes and what needs to be done at international level. And I think that's some area that we need to be pressing very, very hard in the next few weeks. And I think there's certainly scope for the UK to take a leading role in cooperation with other countries on the Security Council, if that is the best way forward. And I think there's a lot to be said for it. Could I just also add to that? I think an inquiry is important in its own right, but it's also important, I think, as a first step towards a process of change. And, you know, I mentioned earlier on the influence of Hezbollah in the country. And I think that's important, but it shouldn't be exaggerated too much. There are other religious and political vested interests in the country as well. And it's not simply that one faction has too much influence. The whole system needs to be changed and reformulated completely. And I think going back to one of the points that George was making earlier, I think that one of the things that we need to be doing is giving more support to civil society, because it's a very telling point that there's been mass demonstrations in Lebanon, but very few demands and specific policies going forward. And I think that it's all very well to have sentiment, but the process of practical change requires a political agenda to be created. And it's the formulation of that agenda has to be a priority in the future. And then it's up to us to muster international forces behind that agenda.
Mm. And I would agree with Wayne. I'm very interested to hear about the way forward through the UN Security Council, because that then bypasses any possibility of the current governance model interference or otherwise. I think that's something that both Wayne and myself can be pushing for when we go back next week. Parliament begins again. We as Labour can be really pushing the UK government on this to make sure that there's a robust international investigation, but done the correct way. So I'm really interested now that in your solution there, and it would be really good to speak to you further about that. I'm sure Wayne would like to too, because we need to find those ways forward. We need to have solutions that we can put to government. And as has been said, you know, this isn't about political point scoring. This is about, for us in the UK, this is about finding a way forward for Lebanon, for the future, for now to look into what went wrong, but also to help rebuild, because what is going on there, what has been going on there, the economic, social, political crises that we have seen, the instability for refugees that are there, the really important routes through the country for aid, through to Syria, which are really, really worrying at the moment, actually, in terms of the Syrian border. That was a vital route through to Syria for aid. I'm going to be pressing on that when we go back. But we need to see progress, and we need to see this rebuild. We can't have more of the same, and that needs to be led by the international community. Pressure needs to be put. The right international independent investigation needs to happen very quickly. So I'd be very pleased to speak to you further about that, so that we can be putting that pressure where's needed.
Thanks, Anna. And if there's the need for the international community to exert pressure, George, I was wondering what within Lebanon, what type of advocacy can be very influential in getting at least some MPs in Lebanon to come out in support of an international investigation?
Like in Lebanon, there's certainly something you can do, but like as like initially, what needs to be done is supporting efforts such as Nada's effort in like bringing up the victims together and like having the victims actually choose and be in the lead of like how they want to see the shape of the judicial process, or like the investigation process. This is very similar to any transitional justice process where the victims should be the lead. This is for me what MPs should be doing primarily, is supporting and if there are like allies among the MPs in Lebanon, if there are, like to support these efforts in some way, and like allow the victims to actually take the lead into this debate and in some way. The request for an independent inquiry, or an international independent inquiry from Lebanese MPs, it's I don't see it viable, or I don't see it happening in Parliament, because like procedurally is difficult. They can be like as individuals be outspoken, as like community leaders be outspoken, but like I don't think it will go through Parliament. Like it's not the role of Parliament. But which brings me back to another absurdity, and this is another reason why there is an importance to have an international inquiry, is that if there are ministers or like presidents that are going to be found allegedly guilty of the crime, basically it would be the Supreme Court of the Supreme Court for the accountability of presidents and ministers that will have to actually sentence, or that will have to oversee the judicial process, and this court is actually made from 7 MPs. So you can actually clearly see how the corruption and like the lack of impartiality will, even in the Lebanese process, if it reach a level of seriousness, the confusion and like the how much there's conflict of interest, and how much the current MPs that we know who they represent will actually eventually take the lead into the sentence, it's a completely bad system the way it's set. Like even if we reach so much into the system in an impartial way, and we reach the sentencing process, we're going to expect a court made from 7 MPs, the current parliament that you have all the problems with, to actually do that. It's impossible. Like I don't see the Lebanese system able to deal with the size of this. It's not a political, and this is why it's not a partisan appeal. It's not a political like agenda that is behind this request. It's clearly a technical advocacy that the system cannot deal with this issue, and this is why there's always recourse to higher form or an external impartial system. In Europe or in other regional bodies, there's the European Court of Human Rights, or there's the African Court, there's African Court, or the Inter-American Court. In Lebanon, this is, or in the region at least, like we're not like known for like the progress and the advancement in human rights, or any kind of international criminal justice. So So this needs to come in order to like create further trust. Similarly to the STA, there's a big element that is missing, is the legacy and how much we actually give back to the Lebanese judiciary around that. The UK and other governments have been investing a lot since 2005 in like prosecutorial capacity building. And like my question is, what happened since 2005 with those millions of pounds and euros and dollars being spent on training the security sector and training prosecutors? If we are still as experts here around this webinar, we actually see them as still incompetent and unable to actually do that. So there's a problem with the willingness and there's a problem with ability. And when there's unwillingness and inability, the best way is an international inquiry. And this is the same argument if we go back to like the commission that was created in 2005 after the assassination of former Prime Minister Hafti Hariri, and we see the report that they have produced on the 23rd of March 2005, we can clearly see the same arguments still imposed. Lebanese law enforcement agency, the prosecutors are unable to deal with the size of the crime and unable to provide Lebanese citizens with the truth of the events. The same still applies. Like it's not, we have not done much since 2005. And my message also, because this is a UK audience, we can no longer tolerate this trade-off between it's okay, Lebanon has to remain stable, so it's fine if you appoint bad judges here, it's fine, we can still support security agencies, okay, even if you do like torture of 5 Syrian refugees dying under torture, it's all right, change the units and we'll keep on providing aid. We'll make sure the due diligence doesn't cover that. We can no longer tolerate like this. Since 2005, there's been a lot of tolerance about the system, and it led to the same, it's always leading to the same result. I think it really needs like some cutoff now, and like, and deal with it as a judicial process on the side of a transitional process, and have this truth of the event, truth of who's responsible for this corruption, and reconciliation between the polity and the Lebanese citizens.
Thanks very much for that, George. And if what George has said is that there is no room for Lebanon internally to have the process or the capacity to conduct such an investigation, and the only way is external pressure from the international community, I wonder, Aya, if you can finish us as our last panelist on this question and detail to us with human rights expertise and advocacy, what are the key players, do you think, across the world, and which actors do you think should be targeted in bringing about an international independent investigation?
And I absolutely agree with George, and particularly his last point, in stressing that the international community has been complicit in propping up the Lebanese system in the way it is, with this trade-off of stability and the devil we know versus an unknown. And that has now become unsustainable. So what we're calling for is, obviously an international investigation, given the unwillingness and inability of the Lebanese judiciary to conduct this investigation, but also to stop channeling aid and loans to the Lebanese government. So for years, more than $20 billion have been channeled to the Lebanese government with the hopes that some of this money will trickle down to the general public. But the end result is these politicians have enriched themselves at the expense of citizens and the international community, while people in the country have gradually seen their standards of living decline, while they've been robbed of access to quality education, healthcare, housing, and other very basic services. So I think the international community now has a major role to play in saying enough. We are not going to subsidize this criminal, corrupt, incompetent government anymore for the sake of stability. The protests have showed that there is mass discontent with the Lebanese political establishment, but the aftermath of the Beirut blast has also showed that there are organizations working on the ground who are able to handle large sums of money, who are able to distribute aid efficiently, able to do needs assessments. And so I think, you know, the international community should really start looking into how it can directly support these local and international organizations, providing direct support on the ground and circumvent the Lebanese government. We're currently working on a statement that we're going to put out by the end of next week, I hope, detailing what such a mechanism could look like, looking at the experience of Syria and some other countries where the government has failed and the international community has channeled aid. What has worked in other contexts? What hasn't? How do you empower civil society? How do you make the leap from, you know, viewing them not just as civil society, so, you know, watchdogs, but how do you empower them and give them a political platform? How do you engage with them as political, you know, on a political level, not just as individuals who are, acting as the traditional civil society? So I think that, you know, the next step will be the international community making very clear that the Lebanese government has lost legitimacy and looking for alternative sources of power that are very much driven by Lebanese civil society and Lebanese citizens and residents.
Thank you, Aya. A really excellent point there on ending that international complicity in propping up this very corrupt government and the tacit endorsement that has been ongoing so far. As the quote goes, if you are silent in the face of oppression, you've chosen the side of the oppressor. So I think you absolutely mastered fleshing all of that out. And I wanted generally to say a massive thank you to all of our panelists and my co-chair, Alexander, for attending, for taking a myriad of questions, for coming and being here with us tonight, and to all the audience for their questions and for attending. So I'll be dispersing all the kind of resources that we've talked about. Human Rights Watch, so Aya, if you want to send me that statement, for example, that you're going to be putting out, George, any kind of resources you want me to share. Nada's already put a Facebook link in the chat for, it's a victims page. So it'd be really helpful in the age of social media to go to that page, like it, share it, and just engage, because in the world that we live in, and especially in lockdown and the different situation we all find ourselves in, engaging online can sometimes do more than physically turning up. So massive thank you again to everyone, and I hope this fosters some pressure, this fosters communication going forward, and have a great rest of your evenings.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very much.
Thanks.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Thank you, bye.